Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr. was the 38th President of the United States, serving from 1974 to 1977. A member of the Republican Party, Ford assumed the presidency after President Richard Nixon resigned, under whom he had served as the 40th Vice President from 1973 to 1974. Prior to that, he served as a member of the United States House of Representatives from 1949 to 1973. Ford was born in Omaha, Nebraska and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He attended the University of Michigan, where he played for the school's football team, before eventually attending Yale Law School. Afterward, he served in the U.S. Naval Reserve from 1942 to 1946. Ford began his political career in 1949 as the U.S. Representative from Michigan's 5th Congressional District, serving in this capacity for nearly 25 years, the final 9 of them as the House Minority Leader. In December 1973, 2 months after Spiro Agnew's resignation, Ford became the first person appointed to the vice presidency under the terms of the 25th Amendment. After the subsequent resignation of Nixon in August 1974, Ford immediately assumed the presidency. Domestically, Ford presided over the worst economy in the 4 decades since the Great Depression, with growing inflation and a recession. In one of his most controversial acts, he granted a presidential pardon to Nixon for his role in the Watergate scandal. Foreign policy was characterized in procedural terms by the increased role Congress began to play, and by the corresponding curb on the powers of the president. Ford signed the Helsinki Accords, which marked a move toward détente in the Cold War. With the collapse of South Vietnam 9 months into his presidency, U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War essentially ended. In the 1976 Republican presidential primary, he defeated Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination, but narrowly lost the presidential election to the Democratic candidate, Jimmy Carter. Ford remains the only person to serve as president without winning an election for president or vice president. Following his years as president, Ford remained active in the Republican Party, but his moderate views on various social issues increasingly put him at odds with conservative members of the party in the 1990s and early 2000s. He also set aside the enmity he had felt towards Carter following the 1976 election, and the two former presidents developed a close friendship. After experiencing a series of health problems, he died in Rancho Mirage, California in 2006. Surveys of historians and political scientists have ranked Ford as a below-average president, though retrospective public polls on his time in office were more positive. Gerald Ford's tenure as the 38th President of the United States began on August 9, 1974, upon the resignation of President Richard Nixon, and ended on January 20, 1977. Ford, a Republican from Michigan, had been appointed vice president on December 6, 1973, following the resignation of Spiro Agnew from that office. Ford was the only person to serve as president without being elected to either the presidency or the vice presidency. His presidency ended following his narrow defeat in the 1976 presidential election to Democrat Jimmy Carter, after a period of 895 days in office. Ford took office in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal and in the final stages of the Vietnam War, both of which engendered a new disillusion in American political institutions. Ford's first major act upon taking office was to grant a presidential pardon to Nixon for his role in the Watergate scandal, prompting a major backlash to Ford's presidency. He also created a conditional clemency program for Vietnam War draft dodgers. Much of Ford's focus in domestic policy was on the economy, which experienced a recession during his tenure. After initially promoting a tax increase designed to combat inflation, Ford championed a tax cut designed to rejuvenate the economy, and he signed 2 tax reduction acts into law. The foreign policy of the Ford administration was characterized in procedural terms by the increased role Congress began to play, and by the corresponding curb on the powers of the president. Overcoming significant congressional opposition, Ford continued Nixon's détente policies with the Soviet Union. In the 1976 presidential election, Ford was challenged by Ronald Reagan, a leader of the conservative wing of the Republican Party. After a contentious series of primaries, Ford narrowly won the nomination at the 1976 Republican National Convention. In the general election, Ford lost to Carter by a narrow margin in the popular and electoral vote. In polls of historians and political scientists, Ford is generally ranked as a below-average president, much like both his predecessor and successor. When Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, Ford automatically assumed the presidency, taking the oath of office in the East Room of the White House. This made him the only person to become the nation's chief executive without being elected to the presidency or the vice presidency. Immediately afterward, he spoke to the assembled audience in a speech that was broadcast live to the nation, noting the peculiarity of his position. He later declared that our long national nightmare is over. On August 20, Ford nominated former New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller to fill the vice presidency he had vacated. Rockefeller's top competitor had been George H.W. Bush. Rockefeller underwent extended hearings before Congress, which caused embarrassment when it was revealed he made large gifts to senior aides, such as Henry Kissinger. Although conservative Republicans were not pleased that Rockefeller was picked, most of them voted for his confirmation, and his nomination passed both the House and Senate. Some, including Barry Goldwater, voted against him. Ford was the target of 2 assassination attempts during his presidency. In Sacramento, California, on September 5, 1975, Lynette Squeaky Fromm, a follower of Charles Manson, pointed a Colt .45 caliber handgun at Ford and pulled the trigger at point-blank range. 145-146 as she did, Larry Buendorf, a Secret Service agent, grabbed the gun, and Fromm was taken into custody. She was later convicted of attempted assassination of the president and was sentenced to life in prison. She was paroled on August 14, 2009, after serving 34 years. In reaction to this attempt, the Secret Service began keeping Ford at a more secure distance from anonymous crowds, a strategy that may have saved his life 17 days later. As he left the St. Francis Hotel in downtown San Francisco, Sarah Jane Moore, standing in a crowd of onlookers across the street, fired a .38 caliber revolver at him. The shot missed Ford by a few feet. Before she fired a second round, retired Marine Oliver Sipple grabbed at the gun and deflected her shot. The bullet struck a wall about 6 inches above and to the right of Ford's head, then ricocheted and hit a taxi driver, who was slightly wounded. Moore was later sentenced to life in prison. She was paroled on December 31, 2007, after serving 32 years. Carter won the election, receiving 50.1% of the popular vote and 297 electoral votes compared with 48% and 240 electoral votes for Ford. Ford died on December 26, 2006, at his home in Rancho Mirage, California, of arteriosclerotic cerebrovascular disease and diffuse arteriosclerosis. He had end-stage coronary artery disease and severe aortic stenosis and insufficiency, caused by calcific alteration of one of his heart valves. At the time of his death, Ford was the longest-lived U.S. president, having lived 93 years and 165 days, 45 days longer than Ronald Reagan, whose record he surpassed. He died on the 34th anniversary of President Harry S. Truman's death. He was the last surviving member of the Warren Commission. On December 30, 2006, Ford became the 11th U.S. president to lie in state in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. A state funeral and memorial services were held at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., on Tuesday, January 2, 2007. After the service, Ford was interred at his Presidential Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Scouting was so important to Ford that his family asked for scouts to participate in his funeral. A few selected scouts served as ushers inside the National Cathedral. About 400 Eagle Scouts were part of the funeral procession, where they formed an honor guard as the casket went by in front of the museum. One of the songs selected by Ford during the procession was the University of Michigan fight song, as it was a favorite of his that he preferred go be played during his presidency. After his death in December 2006, the University of Michigan Marching Band played the school's fight song for him one final time, for his last ride from the Gerald R. Ford Airport in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The state of Michigan commissioned and submitted a statue of Ford to the National Statuary Hall collection, replacing Zachariah Chandler. It was unveiled on May 3, 2011, in the Capitol Rotunda. Speaking of his stepfather and his mother, Ford said, "My stepfather was a magnificent person and my mother equally wonderful. So I couldn't have written a better prescription for a superb family upbringing." Ford had 3 half-siblings from the second marriage of his biological father, Leslie King Sr., Marjorie King, 1921–1993, Leslie Henry King, 1923–1976, and Patricia Jane King, 1925–1980. They never saw one another as children, and he did not know them at all until 1960. Ford was not aware of his biological father until he was 17, when his parents told him about the circumstances of his birth. That year, his biological father, whom Ford described as a carefree, well-to-do man who didn't really give a damn about the hopes and dreams of his firstborn son, approached Ford while he was waiting tables in a Grand Rapids restaurant. The two maintained a sporadic contact until Leslie King Sr.'s death in 1941. On October 15, 1948, Ford married Elizabeth Bloomer, 1918–2011, at Grace Episcopal Church in Grand Rapids. It was his first and only marriage, and her second one. Her previous marriage, to William Warren, lasted 5 years and ended in divorce. Bloomer, who was originally from Grand Rapids herself, had been living in New York City for several years, where she had been working as a John Robert Powers fashion model, and as a dancer in the auxiliary troupe of the Martha Graham Dance Company. At the time of their engagement, Ford was campaigning for what would be the first of his 13 terms as a member of the United States House of Representatives. They delayed their wedding until shortly before the election because, as the New York Times reported in a 1974 profile of Betty Ford, Jerry Ford was running for Congress and wasn't sure how voters might feel about his marrying a divorced ex-dancer. The couple had 4 children: Michael Gerald, born in 1950, John Gardner, known as Jack, born in 1952, Stephen Meigs, born in 1956, and Susan Elizabeth, born in 1957. Ford was a member of several civic and fraternal organizations, including the Junior Chamber of Commerce, Jaycees, American Legion, AMVETS, Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks, Sons of the Revolution, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and was an alumnus of Delta Kappa Epsilon at Michigan. Ford was initiated into Freemasonry on September 30, 1949. He later said in 1975, "When I took my obligation as a Master Mason incidentally, with my 3 younger brothers, I recalled the value my own father attached to that order. But I had no idea that I would ever be added to the company of the father of our country and 12 other members of the order who also served as presidents of the United States." Ford was made a 33 degrees Scottish Rite Mason on September 26, 1962. In April 1975, Ford was elected by a unanimous vote honorary Grand Master of the International Supreme Council, Order of Demolay, a position in which he served until January 1977. Ford received the degrees of York Rite Masonry, Chapter and Council degrees, in a special ceremony in the Oval Office on January 11, 1977, during his term as President of the United States. Ford was also a member of the Shriners and the Royal Order of Jesters, both being affiliated bodies of Freemasonry. Ford is the only person to hold the presidential office without being elected as either president or vice president. The choice of Ford to fill the vacant vice presidency was based on Ford's reputation for openness and honesty. "In all the years I sat in the House, I never knew Mr. Ford to make a dishonest statement nor a statement part true and part false. He never attempted to shade a statement, and I never heard him utter an unkind word," said Martha Griffiths. According to the Gallup organization, Ford took office with the fourth highest approval rating for a president following their inauguration, but the trust the American public had in him was rapidly and severely tarnished by the pardon of Nixon, and his ratings fell an unprecedented 21 points. By January 1975, his disapproval rating had surpassed his approval rating. In recent years, many grant in hindsight that Ford had respectably discharged with considerable dignity a great responsibility that he had not sought regarding the Nixon pardon. In spite of his athletic record and remarkable career accomplishments, Ford acquired a reputation as a clumsy, likable, and simple-minded everyman. Henry Kissinger described him as close to a normal human being as we'll ever get in that office. Other pieces of the everyman image were attributed to his inevitable comparison with Nixon, his Midwestern stodginess, and his self-deprecation. An incident in 1975, when Ford tripped while exiting Air Force One in Austria, was famously and repeatedly parodied by Chevy Chase on Saturday Night Live, cementing Ford's image as a klutz. Additionally, an incident in April 1976, when Ford bit into a still shuck-wrapped tamale, a culinary faux pas, made national news and contributed to the image of Ford as a chronic bumbler. The incident has become a cautionary tale about the hazards of eating on the campaign trail. Ford has notably been portrayed in 2 television productions which included a central focus on his wife, the Emmy-winning 1987 ABC biographical television movie The Betty Ford Story and the 2022 Showtime television series The First Lady. Thank you for watching this video.